So welcome back for the first afternoon session of the conference. And we have three very exciting papers lined up, and the theme is Buddhism, but they're going to cover different ground chronologically and geographically. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the three speakers for this session. Sudha Gopalakrishnan is Executive Director of the International Research Division, India International Center, a PhD in Comparative Literature and Drama. Dr. Gopalakrishnan was Founder, Director, National Mission for Manuscripts, Executive Director of Sahapedia, an online encyclopedia on Indian culture, which I think most of us know about, and worked with the IGNCA and Sahitya Academy. She has 8 books on the performing arts and literature and translations from Malayalam and Sanskrit, and she's also one of the leading figures behind the organizing of this conference. Professor Shashibala is Dean, Bhavan's K.M. Munshi Center for Indology, and Chair, Acharya Raghuveer, Bhartiya Vidya Bhavan, Delhi Kendra. She specializes in India's cultural contribution to the world, history of the arts, Buddhism, and cross-cultural connections across political boundaries. She has published 25 books and 110 research papers, curated exhibitions, designed courses, and traveled widely to document Indian cultural relics abroad. She is a recipient of the highest civilian state award in Mongolia, the Order of the Polar Star. She is President, International Council of Cultural Studies, Bharat, and founder member, International Buddhist Confederation. She was visiting professor at the National Museum Institute, where she taught art history for 15 years. And she's also been guest professor at Bristol and Ural Federal Universities and consultant at the IGNCA. Our third speaker is Professor Baatr Kitinov. He is a leading research fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and he specializes in the history of Buddhism among nomads. I'm really glad we're bringing the nomads into the conference. He also specializes in Tibetan Buddhism and Buddhism in Russia and Central Asia. His research encompasses religion, politics, ideology, and identity. He received research fellowships in the UK, India, and Lead International. He is a member of international associations and served as cultural envoy of Mongolia in Russia. Dr. Kitinov has delivered lectures and seminars worldwide and published extensively in various countries. So these are our three speakers, and it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Gopalakrishnan to present her paper. There will be 3 presentations of 20 minutes each, and after that we will have about half an hour for discussion. Sudha, over to you.
Thank you. I go there? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm going straight into my topic, which is Gaṇḍavyūha, a text, for a Buddhist text, a story of travel, reconnaissance, and revelation. So today, this is about this book, manuscript, in fact, a manuscript that traveled across Asia, and a character within the text who also traveled in search of the supreme knowledge from the Buddhist heritage. It's a Mahayana text called Gaṇḍavyūha, an Indian Buddhist text ascribed to the 1st century BCE. Written originally in Sanskrit, the manuscripts and the ideas it presented traveled across continents, initially in Southeast Asia and later to the other parts of the globe as well. And its content also, like I said, deals with travel, of course, of a different nature. I want to say at the outset that this reading of my text started about 5 years ago. It's a Sanskrit text. When I wanted to visit the Borobudur temple near Yogyakarta in Java, I knew that the temple had panels of Lalita Vistara, the Jataka stories, and also Gaṇḍavyūha. And since I knew that also it had more than 500 panels out of the 2,700 relief panels in Borobudur, so I wanted to know what the text contains and what it is all about. Looking up the name, I saw that it's a well-known text among the Buddhist scholars and is located in the Avatamsaka Sutra, a Mahayana text called in English as the Flower Ornament Sutra, which describes the activities and practice of bodhisattvas. Gaṇḍavyūha is the final chapter of the Avatamsaka, It has captured the imagination of scholars and seekers worldwide and translated into different languages and also relieved and seen in multiple sources also. So, Gaṇḍavyūha starts with the travels of Sudhana, a wealthy merchant, seeking perfect knowledge, the way of the Buddha and the Bodhisattva. Through his journey, Sudhana meets more than 50 people from different areas of life, all enlightened Buddhas or rather Bodhisattvas, who are called Kalyana Mitras, good friends, people of high wisdom. At the end of this journey, both physical and spiritual, and after these meetings with Kalyana Mitras, Sudhana experiences an illumined vision when he meets Maitreya, the future Buddha, and lastly Samantabhadra, the Bodhisattva. Coming to the geographical origin of the Gaṇḍavyūha, about the text, the origin of the text is in South India. As in the text, Dhanyakara, Dharanikota in Palnadu district of the present, located in Amaravati, is the name of Sudhana's hometown. It is his birthplace, the place where the journey begins and it ends also. Scholars ascribe this to the Dhanyakataka in the Ikshwaku dynasty, a city near Amaravati where Buddhism is said to have thrived in those days. So the characters of the Gaṇḍavyūha are from different sections of society, the Kalyana Mitras that I am talking about, and different occupations, perhaps in touch with urban centers during the middle period of Indian Buddhism. Of the 41 locations visited by Sudhana and mentioned by name, 19 are referred to as Nagara, town or city. Sudhana begins his quest in Dhanyakara, which is called a Mahanagara. This term no doubt implying a substantial urban center. Coming to the theme of Gaṇḍavyūha, at a glance, Gaṇḍavyūha is about a quest and its completion, and the whole action happens in South India not so much as a geographical area, I would like to say, but also as an imagined territory. At the outset of the text, there is a spectacular description of the Buddha in Samadhi in Jetavana, the Jeta Grove, where bodhisattvas from different Buddha fields, Buddha Kshetra, visit the Buddha and encounter the illuminating experience of entering the Buddha field of Mahakaruna. After this experience of the Buddha's Mahasamadhi, described in highly evocative terms in the text, the Bodhisattva Manjushri leaves the Buddha's assembly and goes to the south. Manjushri, by visiting Dhanyakara, gazes upon this young boy called Sudhana and identifies Bodhisattva qualities in him. Having stopped in his city, he preaches the Dharma to a large congregation of people, and as he is leaving, Sudhana recites verses praising him and asks him to show the way to enlightenment. In response, the Bodhisattva says, and I am leaving the quotation for want of time, at the behest of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, Sudhana takes to travelling for years and years, meets with 52 good friends as spiritual guides in his quest for enlightenment. These visits start with the country of Ramavaranta, where he meets Meghashri, who in turn sends him to the next one called Sagara Megha, then to Supratishthita, to Megha, and so on. The Kalyana Mitras Sudhana encounters in these locations are of many different types. Among them we find 5 monks, a nun, a Brahmin, a perfumer, a homeless wanderer, a mariner, a teacher, a goldsmith, 3 princesses, 2 queens, 2 kings, 5 bodhisattvas, and 10 goddesses. There are men like Avalokiteshvara, and also powerful women like Queen Asha, Princess Maitrayani, Vasumitra skilled in languages, earth goddesses, night goddesses, a courtesan named Vasumitra, Gopa the wife of Buddha, Maya the queen mother, and lastly 3 most significant ones, Maitreya, Manjushri, and Samantabhadra. So while these are all mostly spiritually advanced teachers, Maitreya, the future Buddha, leads him to the divine tower, a special place called Kotagara, indescribable but still described with great reverence as the Gaṇḍavyūha's vision of supreme reality. This experience envelops Sudhana with delight, making him see eons, realms, beings, bodhisattvas and Buddhas, and he himself. I can't help quoting this small little quotation. So, a metaphorical representation of Dharma Dhatu as a supreme array. So, to quoting this passage, to quote, when he went into that Kotagara, in the middle of the great tower, he saw the billion world universe, and everywhere there was Sudhana at Maitreya's feet. Thus, Sudhana saw Maitreya's practices of transcendence over countless eons, kalpas. He saw the whole supreme manifestation. He was perfectly aware of it, understood it, contemplated it, used it as a means, beheld it, and saw himself there. It's a wonder that he's talking about an experience, a kind of divine experience, but talking it also in terms of a highly physical reality, like a architectural space, which also represents the, so there's a lot of complexity there in the imagining. So coming to the spread of the text to other parts than India, Gaṇḍavyūha has gone early in the first half of the first millennium to Nepal, China, Japan and Indonesia, and now folios of manuscripts are spread across archives in some universities in the West also. So manuscripts, the Chinese translations, the first evidence of the text is in Chinese catalogues of the Buddhist canon, composed in the 6th, 7th and 8th century CE, where it is recorded that it was first translated into Chinese by the monk Shen Qian sometime between 38 and 408 CE. The second translation in Chinese was soon followed in 420, and it is entitled the chapter on the entrance into the Dharma realm, Dharma Dhatu Praveshana Parivarta, and it was translated by Buddhabhadra and his team of translators as the final chapter of the Avatamsaka. Then again it was translated between 695 and 699 by a Khotanese monk, Shikshananda, and his team of translators. The fourth and the final Chinese translation was completed in 798 by the Kashmiri monk Prajna, and it is based on an expanded and no longer extant Sanskrit version belonging presumably to Shubhakara Deva, the king of Orissa, who sent his personal copy as a gift to the emperor in 795. Thomas Cleary, the translator of the Avatamsaka Sutra, in a brief discussion says that these additions appear to be explanations or amplifications of the text which may be attributed to Prajna and his assistants. Or maybe it is that the king of Orissa possessed an expanded version of the Sanskrit text, we don't know, it doesn't exist now, no longer extant in the surviving manuscripts. This hypothesis assumes the possibility of an undiscovered Sanskrit version, which we can still look for, corresponding to Prajna's translation. So coming to the paintings, it seems that none of the existing works of art are based on the Gaṇḍavyūha, date from the period when Avatamsaka Buddhism was at the height of its spiritual influence, but all date from a later period of revival. For example, I'm quoting something which I think going to skip. Apart from handwritten text, there are paintings on palm leaf and scrolls, woodblock printing, sculpture, and relief panels on the grand theme of Gaṇḍavyūha. There are 57 leaves of the manuscript available in the Freer Gallery of Art, the National Museum of Asian Art at the Smithsonian. Now coming to Tibetan translation is the next earliest evidence of the Gaṇḍavyūha after the Chinese translations. Following the initial translation efforts in the early 9th century, after several centuries of textual transmission, the distinct Tibetan Kanjur collections began to emerge in the 14th century, and textual variations found in the Gaṇḍavyūha reflect transmissional variation, all stemming from one original single Tibetan translation of a Sanskrit text. So coming to Japan, Japan has a very long history with the Gaṇḍavyūha and the Avatamsaka text. The propagation of the Avatamsaka doctrine in Japan is supposed to have started with the arrival of the Chinese monk Tao Xuan of the Qigong sect in 736 CE. He wrote commentaries on the Vinaya texts and was also part of the translation team that assisted in translating the sutras from Sanskrit into Chinese. What he brought to Japan appears to be the sect which is the first information on Avatamsaka Buddhism in Japan. Skipping more. On the occasion of the consecration of the great Buddha in 752 AD, the officiating monk was an Indian, a Tamilian priest named Bodhisena, who seems to have been inspired by Manjushri's teaching, went to China and to Japan. Bodhisena had an interesting life, which unfortunately is not part of this conference, but should have been, I think, or maybe in another time perhaps. At the ceremony, interesting overseas music and dancing, mainly from China and Korea, are supposed to have been performed. And in the small shrines where the 6 Nara sects are placed, I'm skipping and reading, there are quite many figurines mentioned in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and also doors painted with gods of morning and night, Bhikshus, Sagira Megha and Sarvadhwaja, and also the 3rd and the 7th of the Sudhana's Kalyana Mitras. Then there is a 10th century account of a Buddhist chronicle, of which the 3rd and the last part are devoted to a description of temple festivals. It gives a description of the Avatamsaka ceremony, and more than 50 figurines representing the Sudhana and his Kalyana Mitras, more than 50, each about 7 or 8 sawn in height, were dressed up in brocade costumes and put on display on a platform, while nuns recited passages from the Gaṇḍavyūha. So this ceremony was called the ceremony of the sages. In 54 scenes, so I'm describing that which I'm leaving. There are references to several paintings of Sudhana and his sages, which clearly demonstrate a revival during the early Kamakura period. The story of Sudhana seems to have had a spiritual significance and the ceremonial value in the meditation hall of the Kozanji, where another mandala of Sudhana and his Kalyana Mitras adorned the walls. In this building stood a shrine containing a wooden statue of Sudhana. Then there are scrolls, there are hand scrolls illustrating the pilgrimage of Sudhana in 54 scenes in darkness and light. First of these shows Sudhana receiving his first instruction from Manjushri, and the 53rd shows the final visit to the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra. Now I'm also describing where these are available in the National Museum Nara, Fujita Museum Osaka, in Setsu Inosuke in Tokyo, in the Sugawara family, and also in the National Museum in Tokyo. Coming to Nepalese manuscripts, during the 1950s, a number of illustrated leaves from a Nepalese Gaṇḍavyūha Sutra manuscript were acquired by various Western collections, which we are going to show some illustrations here. There are 38 leaves, 7 leaves at the Cleveland Museum of Art, 2 leaves at the Seattle Art Museum, then at the Virginia Museum, 4 leaves at the Asia Society, and so on. So these are the manuscripts belonging to Nepal, which are in the US collections in different places. Coming to Sanskrit manuscript and editions, we are talking so much about translations. There is no surviving Sanskrit manuscripts of the Gaṇḍavyūha from the first millennium in India. But reference to the Prajna's translation, which I mentioned, is important. The Gaṇḍavyūha Sutra first existed in India as an independent sutra in Sanskrit manuscripts, and earliest version was sent to China by the king of Orissa, who gave a copy to the Chinese emperor in 795, and this was translated by Prajna in 798. And then there is a complete Sanskrit manuscript that dates to 11,066 CE, 300 years later than the Tibetan translation. It has about 289 palm leaf pages and was sent from Nepal to the Royal Society, the society in London, by Mr. Hodgson, 1800 to 1894, in the early 19th century. So in the beginning of the 20th century, between 1934 and 36, T. Suzuki and Itzumi came out with their first printed edition of the text. Suzuki followed this edition with select translations from the Gaṇḍavyūha and an analysis of the text worldview in his 3rd series of essays in Zen Buddhism. And now P.L. Vidya, using the Suzuki and Idumi edition, I'm winding up. So I'm not going into the secondary sources, and last para. Gaṇḍavyūha is the only one example to show how, while traveling across, one example I am giving, but it applies to many other manuscripts from India. While traveling across space, countries, regions, and continent, texts, each text with an authenticity of its own, gets transmuted into new texts as adaptations and become new original texts, and a new ecosystem of knowledge grows around them. Depending on the moorings of specific contexts, these texts become popular or come to disuse, and in many cases they resurrect themselves during another time or another context. I'm concluding with what Bhavabhuti says about his own text. Bhavabhuti in his Sanskrit play writes evocatively about this aspect in one of his plays. The second two verses I am Utpasyatetu mama kopi samana dharma kalohhyayam niravathir vipula cha prithvi. This is a very oft quoted two verses. So if someone has no value for my work today, this effort of mine is not directed at that person. There is someone out there who's like-minded, and after all, time is infinite and the earth is wide. Kalohhyayam niravathir vipulacha prithvi. Thank you. There are some illustrations that I have. Yeah. I'll just run through this in 5 minutes. These are the different Kalyana Mitras that he goes and meets during his travel.
There should be a screen there. It's there.
Now coming to Borobudur, the panels.
Thank you very much, Sudha, for a wonderful presentation about a text that traveled and the protagonist that travels within the text, and all the visual narratives and how they relate or perhaps do not relate entirely to the text. But thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. We move on to the next paper, which is by Professor Shashibala on the life and legacy of Atisha.
So, a very good afternoon to all of you. Professor Upinder Singh chairing the session, Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, Dr. Baatr, Kitinov, Shri Ramsaranji, and all the distinguished scholars in the audience here. It's a great pleasure to talk about to participate in this conference, Asia on the Move, Mobility and Making of Asia. So what does it mean, that making of Asia? What are the major changes that were brought because of mobility? My focus is on mainly about Buddhism, and in Buddhism, Tibet, and in Tibet when we talk about, then it's mainly Atisha, the most venerable master who has still been venerated over 1000 years. So all these masters, they traveled to distant lands. The journeys were so challenging. They were sacrificing their lives. So many people lost their lives coming to India or going from India to these countries. So there is a huge history about it. If we talk about a written history from China, you have more than 250 masters who went from here, from India to China, and more than 100. That is a written record. And those who lost their lives, those who are not, whose travelogues are not recorded, we have, they have faded in history. So, how they changed Asia, what was the major change and how it was brought? Because you know, India created an immense wealth of texts, temples, there were huge universities, monasteries, so there were great treasures. We are not going into details of all this, but the traveling monks, they built bridges. When these monks were traveling and carrying the texts and all kinds of arts, performing arts and visual arts and building temples began. So there was a complete shift from tombs to temples. If you look at pre-Buddhist period in all these countries, mainly because our study has to be based on whatever is the available records, whatever we have discovered from excavations or wherever, inscriptions, literature, scripts and all these things. So Indian culture, Buddhism especially, it played a great role in contributing towards formation of states, fulfilling the needs of the people, including rulers up to the masses. There was no idea of demeaning or destroying. They were very inclusive, assimilating, absorbing. So wherever Buddhism went, it absorbed the local ideas, the local ways of thinking. There are a number of texts, for example, from Tibet and Mongolia. There are more than 5,000 Sanskrit texts that are discovered. They all exist in Tanjore and Kanjur in Tibet and Mongolia, and more than 3,000 in the Tripitaka in China, in Japan and Korea, everywhere. So these are the proofs of the contribution of these monks. So here today I am going to talk about Atisha because of his contribution to resurrecting Buddhism, what he did, what kind of a life he lived, where he was educated, under who were his teachers, and what kind of philosophy, the schools of philosophy he studied. So I just and why Atisha is so important, because he was born in the place where now it is in Bangladesh. The whole of his life was spent in the first part of his life is spent in India, visiting different gurus, universities and different places from north to south. Then he goes to Indonesia to study under another teacher, and then he returns from there, comes again to India, and from there he goes to Tibet via Nepal. So he stays in Nepal also. So during his life, how he traveled, let's first talk about it. So what was happening before him, because this King Srongtsang Gampo, there are different pronunciations, because when we speak Chinese or Japanese terms, it's there are different pronunciations all the time. So Srongtsang Gampo, he had married two princesses. One was Chinese and the other was Nepalese. So again you can see how matrimonial alliances were there to have peace, to have good connections politically also. Then there are many famous masters, Buddhist masters, who went from India to Tibet, but the most prominent are Shantarakshit, and after him is Guru Padmasambhava. Guru Padmasambhava is still venerated in Tibet, in Nepal, in Bhutan, many places. So then there are certain incidents, certain what happened during his stay and what was happening before. We have to check that also. Samya debate is very, very famous about because after that Buddhism was strongly established in Tibet, it became a state religion. So what kind of these monasteries were built, Samya monastery for example, the monks were being initiated and all these things. So Thonmi Sambodh, there is another great scholar, Thonmi Sambodh, who was sent to India to study, and he is the person. With him there was a group of scholars who came to study in India, and they devised a special script for Tibet, because having a script is very important, as I said in the beginning, that formation of state. It happened everywhere, in Tibet or in Mongolia or in Southeast Asia. When people built huge empires, then how to control it, how to administer it. So they required scripts, and this is a huge contribution of Indian masters traveling, we can say, and spreading all this kind of knowledge. So there is a lot that we can talk about the Tibetan script, how it was devised, what happened after that, what kind of manuscripts are discovered, what kind of bilingual manuscripts are discovered from most of these countries. So it's not just that they translate it, but also they transcreate it. When these texts reach different countries, then transcreations also happened, especially in the countries of Southeast Asia. So I'm not focusing on that today. So Atisha's works and activities in India and also Tibet. How we get all this knowledge? Because in Indian sources we don't have enough written about Atisha. It's mainly the Tibetan historical chronicles that give us information, and around more than 100 years people have been working on it. So that way we could find the details of his life, about his biography. There was one scholar cleared herself and she said, the prediction was that if he lives in India, he can live a life of 92 years. But if he goes to Tibet, then maybe his life will be cut short by 20 years. And this is what happened. Finally, he lived only for 75 years. But he took this decision and he went to Tibet because he wanted to help them. There were very good relations with Tibetan monks before Atisha left. There were many monks coming to these universities. Again, there is a long history, so much of information about, especially about Nalanda, that who were the people coming there, studying under whom, who were the masters, and which texts were translated, who were the Chinese coming and staying there, and what texts they translated, and because of those philosophical texts, what kind of change was brought, which are the sects that were developed after these texts were translated into these languages. So, same happened with Atisha. Atisha was initiated by many gurus. He was given training and education by many gurus. He studied under them, maybe around 100 teachers under whom he studied, but still he wanted to go to Indonesia to study under Sedlingpa, Dharmakirti. Sedlingpa is the Tibetan translation of Dharmakirti's name. Dharmakirti was such a renowned scholar of Buddhism, also of Sanskrit. He had been to India before. He was in Nalanda before, and Atisha had already met him. So Atisha knew about Dharmakirti, and it's so amazing to know that even after studying under and getting initiated by so many Indian gurus, he went to Sedlingpa, he went to Indonesia, he visited Sumatra. So I'll show you a few slides about it, that what are so important, that that how his teacher Dharmakirti, what the manuscripts that he gave him to be taken to Tibet. He studied there for 12 years, and finally his teacher suggested him that he should go to the west. He meant Tibet, and many things he carried from Indonesia, from India to Tibet. Before Atisha, there was no Tara worship in Tibet, for example, because Tara is so popular in Tibetan Buddhism, but it was not there before that. Tara was taken the first time by Atisha because Tara was his tutelary deity. He always used to carry a statue of Tara. I'll show you. It's very difficult to get a view of that personal statue of Devi Tara that Atisha used to carry with him. So, there are some very rare photographs from Tibetan monasteries attached to his life. Wherever Atisha lived, where Atisha even visited, even stayed for a night, even stayed for a few days or for a few months, because he was traveling all the time, because the problem was to correct, to give correction, to teach people. So sometimes people say, Atisha has not written huge texts. No, it was not. His life was not meant for that. His life was meant to give correction to the people, to the monks, to revive Buddhism. Bodhipat Pradip is the most famous text written by him. The letter, all his writings are small, but very important. For example, the letter that he wrote to the king of Nepal, that is included in the Tanjore. And the 6 scripts, I'll show you the list, I think. The 6 scripts that he carried with him, they are a part of the Tanjore. They were so important. But the manuscripts, lontars we call it, the palm leaf manuscripts are called lontars. The lontars that were given by his teacher Dharmakirti to be taken to Tibet, only one of them has been identified. I'll show you a photograph of that manuscript and the monastery where it is identified. The rest of other 5 manuscripts are not discovered as yet. So, what kind, I'm sorry, I'm just skipping all this. So what he learnt was, it's not touch screen. Okay. So I was just coming to his, yeah. Oh, it's okay. I changed a little bit. So I wish to just give you a glimpse of the names of the teachers and what he learned from them, the philosophy that he studied under them. For example, he studied Bodhisattva vow under the spiritual guidance of Buddha Bhadra, and then he studied under Vidya Kokila, and he became aware of the pure human nature. He learned emptiness, and he learned meditation intensely. Meditation on nothingness. Shunyata has become so popular all over the Buddhist world. He studied Utpanna and Sampanna Kram, the research, the emergence of and dissolution of this world. Under Avadhuti Pad, he was a Vajrayana master. He practiced rigorous mental training, and there was many feasts and festivals also. He listened to many songs also. He studied Madhyamika philosophy. He was ordinated at a young age, and the lineage of the profound action transmitted by Maitreya, Asang, Vasudbandhu, etc. He carried it forward, the philosophy of Chandrakirti, the philosophy of Nagarjuna. So I'm just skipping all this. Where did he study Mahavibhasha? Because he carried this philosophy. For example, Bodhicitta. Some scholars agree that Bodhicitta was a philosophy that was given to him by an Indian teacher. But some of the Javanese scholars, they say, no, Bodhicitta is originally Javanese concept. But anyway, whatever it is, he took it there. And he went to many places of pilgrimage. And so the entire life of Atisha, you can divide it into two. One part is just to study intensely, and the other part is going to Tibet, traveling there. First, initially, he had gone for 3 years because it was very challenging for him to get permission of his elders at the time when the monasteries were being destroyed. So, but initially he said he's going for 3 years. He reached Western Tibet, and which monastery he was received, I will show you. Oh, so that means I show you the PPT, some photographs. Some of them are rare photographs. How to close it? Okay. It's not touch screen. इसको बंद करके PPT चला दो. So he had studied all kinds of Buddhist and non-Buddhist schools of philosophy. What do I say? Even he had studied medicine. He was a good sculptor also. I'll show you one of his sculptures, self-made sculptures by Atisha. And during his sojourn in Tibet, he was so amazed, because when he reached Samye, he was so astonished, he was so surprised that many of the manuscripts that he could never see in India, they existed at that time in Tibet. It's loose. Is it working now? Okay. So quickly, this is his self-made statue of Atisha. Drepung is the only monastery where we have a complete life of Atisha painted on the walls. So here is the beginning of his beginning of his life. That it shows the birth of Atisha. On top you can see, you can't, I'm sorry. Can you see now? Okay. So, on the top you can see Devi Tara in that top corner, green color. So, she is blessing, and below you can see the mother and with the child. This is the Mahabodhi temple at the time. Green Tara from Kumbum Gyaltsen in Tibet. Atisha on the perilous journey to Sumatra, because journey, of course, we scholars, we say it was easier to travel by sea than by mountains, through deserts and mountainous areas, but still journeys were not so easy. So here you can see Dharmakirti sitting and giving this vase of wisdom to Atisha. This is also from the Direpung monastery. This is Chandi Kalasan, the first temple from Indonesia, from Java, from near Yogyakarta. So that shows that it was built before Tara was introduced into Tibet. So there are 21 Taras there. There is another temple, Chandi Sari, that is also dedicated to goddess Tara. This is one of the panels there from Chandi Sari. Then, because as I said, he had gone to Sumatra. Sumatra and Java were great centers of learning. There is a lot of information about it, that how Buddhist monks were staying there to study even before coming. Singh, for example, he stayed in Java to study Sanskrit grammar, and then he came to India. This is from Warajambi. Again, another monastic complex, so also from Prajna Paramitas. So they look at the beauty of the statues. These are the 6 scripts that were given by Dharmakirti to Atisha to be carried to Tibet. This is the monastery Labrang, where this manuscript is identified as one of the manuscripts that was taken by Atisha, given by Sarlingpa. It's a palm leaf manuscript of 900 years old. Swambhu Nath temple, because when he was going to Nepal, he stayed there, and also a monastery was built there, and Atisha used to deliver discourses there, and this is the Tham Vihara. There are 2 opinions about travel of Atisha because he was going via Nepal. So from Nepal to Tibet, Western Tibet, how he went, there are 2 routes that are identified. One route is, according to one group of scholars, it was through Lake Mansarovar, and the other says that it was through Mustang Valley. So there is some research about it. There are some paintings that are discovered from Mustang. There is one, this example, how these roads were there, stupas in Ngari. And this is the Tholing monastery, where Atisha was given the first royal reception. It's all ruined. Too much of destruction is there, but still we can see a lot on the walls through paintings, and also the ruined sculptures and all. So I'm just skipping these things. This is how Atisha was given the first royal reception in Tibet, in Ngari. This is the first place, Yumbulakang, the castle, the palace, where he reached first time there, and from there he goes to, should I wind up? Okay. So he goes from place to place, travels there, but wherever he went, wherever he visited, it became a sacred place. Yes, this I would like to show you, because it's the staff, the walking stick of Atisha, that still exists there in Atisha Lakhang. He had 2 major disciples, Gaṇḍavyūha and Lekpai Sherab, and this is the place where Atisha found manuscripts which he had never seen even in India. So there is a lot to be talked about Atisha, Gaṇḍavyūha monastery. Wherever he visited, it became sacred, and it is still sacred. This is interesting to see that this is a classroom where Atisha used to teach. So this is in Netang, where he spent the rest of his life. And this is the room, this is his seat where he used to work. So yeah, this is the Tara statue which he used to carry with him wherever he went. These are the stupas carrying his personal belongings and his remains. And this is a seat on which Atisha used to sit, and it's, people have gauged out some clay out of it to be carried home as souvenirs. So this is the stupa. So thank you so much. I'm sorry if I took more time.
Thank you very much, Professor Shashibala. We come to the third paper of this panel. This is Professor Baatr Kitinov. I invite Professor Kitinov to make his presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, dear colleagues. First of all, I want to say that I'm really grateful to the organizers of this international conference for inviting me to participate at this significant scientific event. The study of the path of Buddhism from India to Russia was and is very important and interesting part of the history of Buddhism. And of course it is very huge, long-lasting history. So let me just show me just some glimpse of this long story. But firstly, I want to begin with this picture, which is over here and over here also. You could see it is, here you could read Oirad Messenger to White Burhan, this picture of Nicholas Erich. So Oirad means, actually it is name of my nation. We are Oirats, and we brought Buddhism of Tibetan tradition, of Giluk tradition to Russia at the end of 16th century. From that time up to now, Tibetan Buddhism of Giluk tradition is still flourishing in Russia. But being close neighbors of Muslim people, they called us Kalmaks. So now we are known like Kalmaks, but our own name is Oirat people. So let me begin. The history of transition of Buddhism to Russia is rich in any dimensions, in destination, peoples, events, processes, which played an important role on those processes, etc. This long journey lasted for centuries, when Buddhism was able to enrich the local cultures by its ideas, and in turn itself demonstrated the ability to add the new features to its spiritual achievements. India and Russia are separated from each other by the huge distance, and many nations and cultures of Central Asia paid their contribution to the development of the local forms of Buddha's teaching. In my presentation, I'd like to mention only a few pages of this long and rich story, with indication of the highest events, names and places which anyway formed the features of Buddhism in Russia. Besides, I will underline the short history of Buddhism within the territory of modern Russia. It's widespread opinion that Buddhism began to penetrate from India into Central Asia as early as at the 1st century AD, but some scholars attribute this time already to the epoch of Alexander the Great, end of 4th century BC. The involvement of Central Asia in the sphere of the Macedonian campaigns contributed to the further development, to the further deepening of communication and cooperation between peoples of this region and other peoples of the East. The conquest of Punjab by Emperor Alexander followed. Then he moved his army to the Indus stream and reached the shores of the Great Sea. It was the Indian Ocean. During the last conquest, the emperor met the Buddhist monks, and after talking, he allowed them to preach the Buddhist teaching within his empire. After the death of Alexander, his military leaders, Seleucus and Ptolemy, founded their own states in Asia and Africa, which eventually fell apart. The son of Seleucus, Emperor Antiochus I, approved the Buddhist monks from India as his father to propagate Buddhism all over the empire. In the middle of the 3rd century BC, an independent Greco-Bactrian state arose in the most territory of Central Asia. At the same time, the Parthian kingdom was formed, led by Arsaces, who laid the foundation for the Arsacid dynasty. Greco-Bactrian was an unstable formation from which state of Sokt or Sogdiana first broke away, and later a state of Bactria around 150 BC. Bactria was an ancient Iranian name for the vast region of the upper and the middle river basin of river of Amudarya and its numerous tributaries. During the period of its greatest rise, the Bactrian kingdom had a significant impact on the life of the population of Central Asia. In the field of culture, the Greek and local traditions crossed, which affected the subsequent development of the cultural life of this huge region. While Zoroastrian teaching was preserved, other religious beliefs existed, and also Buddhism. The state around 135 BC ceased to exist due to internal strife and invasions from the northwest of the nomadic Yuezhi tribes. Actually, it is from the Chinese side. The Parthian kingdom included the southern part of Central Asia, where one of the main centers of the kingdom was located, Nisa. It is near modern Ashgabat of Tajikistan. More than 400 years from the end of the 1st century BC and until the middle of the 4th century AD, the last part of Central Asia became part of the Kushan kingdom. The most famous Kushan ruler was Kanishka, who patronized Buddhism in every possible way, and during his reign the 4th Buddhist council was held. The art of the Kushans was unique and beautiful and represents vivid synthesis of architecture, sculpture, and painting. Later, the territory was occupied by the Sassanids of Persia. In the 1st century, Central Asian states became the place of interaction and collision of several forms of religions: Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Manichaeism. During the era of the highest power of the Kushan state, the Buddhist communities spread their influence deep into the valley of the river Sukhandarya. For example, the Kushans erected the large Buddhist buildings in Tarmit and Balkh towns. The local Buddhist communities were rich and influential. After the defeat of Kushans by the Sassanid Iran, Buddhism continued to maintain its influence here and further penetrated to Merv oasis, that is Karakum Desert. Here, over the large area, the Buddhist buildings appeared around 4th and 6th centuries. The north of Bactria and Merv were the final, at least for today, known points of the northwestern spread of Buddhism at that region. At the time in question, this region was also closely connected with Tibet. Consequently, even then, no later than in the 4th century, Buddhism had a certain influence in Tibet. Indeed, the study of historical monuments and sources shows that it was from these regions that Buddhism penetrated to the eastern lands, to the Chinese and Tibetans along the road Fergana Church, it is near modern Tashkent, St. Samirechye, as well as through the famous Vahan, along the mountain passes of eastern Afghanistan and northeastern modern Pakistan. Since the 7th century, Buddhism in Central Asia began to decline. For example, in Samarkand, already in 630, Buddhism had particularly no influence. The Chinese travelers could find only one monastery with a single monk, and they themselves were attacked by the local residents. However, Buddhism continued to flourish in Fergana Valley. And so here, for example, we can mention the information from a book of Ashwagosha, and he mentions the town of Taxila, where Buddhism had a significant influence. Afghanistan also played an extremely important role in the interaction of the civilizations of India, China, Central Asia, and the Caspian Basin, and Greek city-states. One of the most known nations of the eastern part of Central Asia, the Uyghurs, who began to accept Buddhism in its Tokharian and Sogdian versions, beginning from middle of 9th century. By the time of the Mongol campaigns, they had formed their own version of Buddhism, were able to create a huge body of Buddhist literature, translating texts into Uyghur from Tibetan, Chinese, Sanskrit, and other languages. The people had close cultural ties with their neighbors. The Uyghur alphabet established itself among the Naimans and Kirit Mongolian tribes and became widespread among the Western Mongols who were Oirats. A feature of the local cults among the Mongol-speaking people was the sacralization of the space, and this special feature of the local beliefs influenced the formation of these local versions of Buddhism. But the most changes in their spiritual life happened with the spreading of Tibetan Buddhism among them. Tibetan Buddhism is a regional form of the northern version of Buddhism, which began to take shape from the middle of the first millennium AD. This religion became widespread in Tibet during the time of Zonsan Kampo of the Chogyal dynasty. And so we know these four main schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and they all had the influence among the Mongols. And first of all, it was Chalkagyu tradition. Genghis Khan highly valued the Uyghurs, who influenced not only on his political decisions, but also on the cultural achievements of Mongols. The first teachers of Mongols and the first officials of the Mongol Empire were the Uyghurs. For example, at this photo you could see the stela with inscription in Mongolian and Chinese dated middle of the 13th century, which contains the information about Buddhism among Oirat people. There were the objective reasons for the favorable development of Buddhism among the Mongolian peoples. Firstly, the spread and strengthening of Buddhism among the Mongols coincided with the formation of pan-Mongolian statehood. Secondly, Buddhism had not contradict to the interest of the main social forces of society. And thirdly, the influence of other religions were weak compared with the influence of Buddhism. Already from the beginning of the 15th century, these Oirat people began to manifest itself more and more actively in the regional political state. The Oirat Hoshuts were famous, first of all, due to their military support of the Dalai Lama V, and thus they managed him to become the political and religious head of Tibet in 1642. So here you could see the picture from Kircher's book, China Illustrata, with fifth Dalai Lama, then alive, and Gushihan of Oirat Hoshut people, who at that time already dead. As a result of political, religious, and military processes in the 1604 among Oirats, there happened the formation of two Oirat states in Eurasia, with varying degrees of influence of Gelug school among them and other schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Zungar Khanate is shown here just in middle of this map. And Hoshut Oirat Khanate, it is near Kokonor Lake. Also you could see there on the right lower corner, Kalmaki Kokonor, it is written over there. But before these processes, events, from the middle of the 16th century, the Oirats, under the pressure of the neighbors, Turkish people, Eastern Mongols, migrated from the eastern part of Dzungaria, it is modern Xinjiang province of China, towards southern Siberia. For instance, the Turgut Oirats and Derbet Oirats began to go down the river of Irtysh. For instance, here yes. These nomads were roaming along the Siberian rivers Irtysh, Tobol, Om, and others, starting the relationship with the Russian authorities. But the most important result was that this migration actually meant the appearance of Tibetan Buddhism of Gelug tradition in the Russian territory. So here you could see this map. It is shown different tribes of Oirat people, how they migrate from South Siberia, from Tarbagata. Actually, it is the northern part of modern Xinjiang province of China, through southern Siberia to Ural Mountains and a bit to southwest to Caspian Basin, Caspian and Volga region basin. So part of these Oirats became known as Kalmyks, and later they moved to Volga or Caspian region of Russia and established the Kalmyk Khanate over there. In pre-revolutionary Russia, the state patronized Buddhism. Monks were allowed to go to Tibet for studies. The new temples and monasteries were built. The interest of the Romanov ruling family in the activities of this rather small religion in terms of population coverage was one of the most important reasons for the construction of the famous Buddhist temple in St. Petersburg. So it is a Kalmyk Khanate, which was created around 1690s. It is covered. It is covered by yellow color, and actually this is modern pictures of Buddhist temple in Kalmyk Republic, and this is famous Buddhist temple in St. Petersburg, which was constructed in 1913. Actually, this year it was 300 years of Romanov ruling Tsarist family. So to this date, this temple was almost was constructed, and it was dedicated to Kalachakra Buddhist deity. The Buddhist culture in Russia represents a unique combination of the achievements of Eastern, it means Indian, Tibetan, Mongolian, Chinese, and Western Russian civilizations. One of the most remarkable examples of such synthesis is the famous Khushutovsky Khorol. Khushutovsky Khorol, now located within Russian Astrakhan region. The Khorol was built on the instructions of the Kalmyk nobleman Tumen in honor of the victory in war over Emperor Napoleon. Buddhism of the Gelug school penetrated the territory of Buryatia, southern Siberia, in the 17th century. At the beginning of the 18th century, it spread throughout Transbaikalia. So it is temples called Datsans in Buryatia. It is, you could see it is around Baikal Lake. It is one of temples in modern Buryatia, also not far from Ulan-Ude, capital of Buryat Republic. And in the 19th century, after a struggle against shamanism, Buddhism penetrated the Cis-Baikal region. On the territory of Tuva, also situated in the southern Siberia, the remains of the Buddhist temples dated back to the 13th and 14th century. Nevertheless, the spread here, as well as in Altai region of Tibetan Buddhism of Gelug school, should be attributed to the period when these territories became part of the Oirat Jungar Khanate. So it is a statue of Buddha, opened just less than 2 years ago in Tuva region. And this new one, also new building, only 1 year ago it was open. A big one, actually it is biggest in Russia now. It is Altai region, photo from Altai region, small temple in Gorno-Altaysk, capital of this republic, and also small stupa, and you could see this Burhanist flags near the stupa. It's impossible to count all the manifestations of Buddhism in Russia. They cover many material and spiritual achievements of this region. For instance, the sutras. There is quite a lot of Indian sutras which has been translated into other languages. Thus, the well-known Golden Light Sutra, Suvarna Prabhasottama Sutra, and extremely important Mahayana Sutra, was translated into Chinese, Tibetan, and other languages, including Mongolian, Oirat, and others. Other sutras like Prajnaparamita, Prajnaparamidaya Sutra, Vajrachidika Prajnaparamita Sutra, and also they were also spread among Kalmyk and Oirat people, thus presenting on the territory of Russia this type of Buddhist culture. Also, it's important to say that Indian merchants who had their colony in Astrakhan city during 17th century, they visited Kalmyk temples, Buddhist temples, and also had some ceremonies over there. And same Kalmyks being in Astrakhan city, they visited these Hindu temples which were in Astrakhan. But actually here you could see this Golden Light Sutra, which is in Tibetan and Oirat languages, in 2 languages. Okay, yes, so actually I'm finishing with this another part of history of Buddhism in Russia. At this time, 7th and 8th centuries, there was earlier wave of Buddhism. It was Chinese Buddhism in Far East through Bohai state. And actually up to now there is no evidences, but archaeologists they discover some foundations, some like this, for instance. It was when Russians being first in Far East, they could see this Stamkha, but now we have only this rock and some excavations over there. And Buddhism in Russia is still spreading. It becomes popular, especially among young people. For instance, here you could see Amitabha Buddha statue with quite young Russian new followers from Siberia. So Russian. Thus, Russia has a living Buddhist heritage from the various periods of spreading of Buddhism on its territory. Mostly they are connected with the history of the nomads who followed Buddhism, Kalmyk, Oirat, Tuvians, and Altai peoples. But it is important to remember that before reaching the Russian lands, Buddhism traveled through many kingdoms, peoples, and cultures, from Middle East to Far East, passing Central Asia, Tibet, China, and Mongolia. The archaeological evidences, the archival and related sources prove the old aged history of Buddhism in Russia, which is closely connected with the history of Buddhism in Eurasia. And that means with the old passes and events which led this religion from India to Russia. The Russian Buddhism is a bright example of richness of Buddhist civilization, culture, and history. Thank you very much for attention.
So I'd like to thank all 3 speakers for 3 wonderful presentations. And I think the history of Buddhism really is a classic example of how you have to look at things in a global perspective, because you can't look at it in any other way. We've seen how travel and migration were such important parts of Buddhism across many centuries. And the speakers also pointed out how we have to use textual, archaeological, inscriptional, visual sources in order to reconstruct the history of Buddhism and how Buddhism changed as it traveled. So the importance of localization was brought out, I think, quite wonderfully in the various presentations. I think we know about the importance of the movement of Buddhism to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, but I think what was new for me was all the information about Buddhism in Russia, in contemporary Russia. So that was, we have about 15 minutes for discussion. So we'll have to have very brief questions and brief answers. But I would like to start by asking Sudha a question based on the slides you showed us at the end. We know that visual and textual narratives are not one-to-one, there's no one-to-one correlation. So on the basis of your preliminary study of the Borobudur rendering of the Gaṇḍavyūha, how do you describe that relationship between text and visual representation at Borobudur?
Actually, my experience was the opposite. Though it was very complex, like I said, there are more than 500 relief demonstrations there. But we went as a group of people who knew a lot about Buddhism. It was a kind of panel of Buddhist scholars and architecture people, archaeology people who went together. So all of us had to go. We went every day for the 7 days, but I think it would take more than 7 years or maybe more to interpret, understand each other, as you know very well. So we just took in the whole thing. Second day we went panel by panel, floor by floor. There are 5 floors to it, and then we tried to correlate the text to the each panel, and in some cases, at least in about 20, 25, 30 cases, we are able to say that here is Sudhana, this is the verse that is, I mean, not me alone, I mean, but many of these scholars were able to relate this verse to this panel. So in a way, because I don't know what you might have to say about that.
It relates.
It relates.
Although I have not studied it so deeply, but whatever I have done is, for example, what is that sutra of 10 levels of meditation? I have studied those specific 10 levels and the panels there, and they really correlate exactly. And there are much more to study at Borobudur, looking at the panels of Gaṇḍavyūha and others. Because, for example, whenever I go to Borobudur, I come back with more questions than answers.
Absolutely, that's right.
For example, last time I saw that there are so many types of architecture depicted in the panels.
Yeah.
So many types. I had never seen at one place so many different types of architecture. Then I was told by one of my friends, Indonesian friends, that before this Borobudur was, these panels were sculpted, the king, he himself traveled a lot, and whatever he liked, those things were copied, and they are there. It's very interesting.
No, that's very interesting, because in India, in the early historic period, there's so many different ways of telling the Jataka stories in visual form. So if you're seeing a direct correlation between text and visuals, that's quite striking.
Yeah, that is Dashabhumik Sutra. I'm sorry, I forgot the name.
So, are there other questions? Many questions.
Yeah, please.
Yes, Ravi?
My name is Ravi Bhuthalinga. Thank you very much for 3 wonderful presentations. My question is this, that all these travelers undertook very arduous journeys, taking a long time and facing many difficulties. These journeys must also have been expensive to undertake.
Yes.
So how were they financed, and what were the motivations of those financiers, and what did they expect in return?
Shall I answer this? There was nothing that they expected in return, only the spread of dharma and helping people. Number 2, you ask about the finances. Normally they were carrying gold, and it was the most challenging because they were carrying gold, and robbers also knew that they are carrying gold. So that is why there are so many routes. They used to keep changing the routes so that they can save themselves. Another problem was snakes, and especially when they were traveling by desert, then scarcity of water and food. And any other point?
Yes, shall
please.
Yes, please, and then Gitanjali.
I'm Rajneesh Karki. I have a basic question. What made, that may be intriguing many other people also here, and it's a general question. What made Buddhism so mobile and all over Asia and all along for so many centuries and all? Just to continue, whereas in India, like now we have this various other traditions. So let's say you have the Nastikas tradition, the Mahaviras and others, philosophies, and also the various tradition of Vaishnavas and all. We don't see anything like that there. So it's a very basic question, but do we have a definitive understanding?
It's better
now
that someone else answers this.
Professor Kitinov, would you like to? Why were Buddhists so mobile? Very interesting question.
Okay. I believe that people, when they try to open new lands, first of all, I mean nomads, they try to get new ideology or world outlook. And from beginning of Buddhism's influence in Central Asia, when we speak about Turkish people, it was for them important, and they were ready to open new lands. It means that, for instance, when the Greek culture, they formed the notion of oikoumene. In Buddhist culture, I mean in the Eastern culture, in Buddhism also, there was no oikoumene, just due to this teaching. And why it happened like this? It is not discover Buddhism, I think so. It is just attempt of people to understand the world. And when Buddhism appeared, it was time when mankind was ready to think about this, I think so. Sorry.
Shall I add to it a little bit? Shall I add to it a little bit?
Please,
Okay. Very briefly, because Ashoka took such strong measures to spread Buddhism, number one. Number two, many of the members of the royal families from different parts of India, they became monks. And number three, they were not demanding anything, they were just sacrificing. Number four is because of the wisdom that they were carrying. And another, that when the people's lives are shattered, they need something, some solace. Another point is because Buddhism was always absorbing, assimilating the ideas, so it became their own religion very easily. So there are many such things, so we don't have time to discuss
okay,
more.
we have just time for one last question, Gitanjali. And I'm afraid that'll have to be the last question because
Yeah.
we can ask other questions.
Yeah.
Over to you.
So I just have two very quick questions for Dr. Shashibala. I often see Atisha mentioned even in sort of popular pamphlet literature around Ambedkar Jayanti and so on as one of the great kind of teachers of Tibet. I was just wondering if there's any way to think about how he situated himself in Tibet and what he took from around him in the reverse flow, as it were. And for Professor Kitinov, I believe that Russia has a very strong Indological Buddhist studies tradition, especially from the 20s and 30s. So I was wondering what they made of the nomadic, this nomadic Buddhism. And are they also doing anthropology as one of the many ways in which to access that? How do the two, because typically Buddhist studies in the West at that time is very text heavy. So I was just wondering if, I just wanted to know.
Yes, Russia has had earlier this quite profounded Indological studies and also Buddhological studies. And now it tries also to keep this position. As for Buddhism among nomads and contribution in this field, it's quite new one, I could say. It's quite new one issue because during Soviet power this theme just not existed. And only during last 20, 30 years we began to excavate something new at this direction. But anyhow, it's very fruitful and it is very rich in its future excavations and discoverings.
Professor Shashibala, you have the last word.
Okay. Atisha did not want anything in return, number one. Number two, he did not return from in Tibet. He died in Netang. So nothing came back. So even his remains, even his belongings, all are there in stupas. I could not explain this, we don't have time. Then Atisha loved Tibetans so much because of being the people on the path of Dharma. And when Dharma was dying there, and Yeshio himself, the king himself, he sacrificed his life. So it's a beautiful story, but we don't have time to tell all those stories. So because he had himself sacrificed his life, and enough of gold was sent because of his sacrifice. So I'll tell you the story later on maybe. Because the gold was always brought to India for traveling, for financing the travels, and also it was donated to the monasteries and the universities where these people were staying and learning. So there should have been a lot of gold in Nalanda and other universities. I don't know, there is no record.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions. You can continue the discussions over tea. Yeah. And I believe there's a 15-minute tea break.
10 minutes.
We'll reconvene at 4 o'clock, so we do have some time.
Oh, then we have.
So you have time for the discussions, but over tea, please. And thank you very much, Professor Upinder Singh, for steering this as expertly as the Asian Encounters and other conferences. I request Sudha ji to honor our chair, our speakers. And we reconvene at 4 o'clock.